So whenever I hear somebody say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to build all this densification downtown, all these apartments and stuff, it's like, for who? Because when you look at it, maybe it's actually for older people who are going to move to those places. They're not going to use bike. They're not going around on bike lanes. Maybe you need to convert that probably to mobility device lanes or whatever. But when I say that to somebody, it's like, or this is nonsense, because I've got this vision of what the ideal city looks like, in which it's, you go to your small apartment with its low carbon footprint, where you live with all these people who are just like you, and you're, a young up and comer, and this is where you're going to live, and you're going to get on your bicycle and you're going to, go off to your office where you're going to sit in these kind of communal sorts of things where you can all spark these great ideas off of each other and work in this kind of communal type of environment. And it's like, yeah, a lot of those people left.
Today's guest is Dr. Darrell Bricker, who is the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, a public opinion research firm, and is also the co-author of the book Empty Planet: The Shock of Global Population Decline. Thank you, Darrell, for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me on, Josie.
In researching your book, Empty Planet, you and your co-author traveled to 6 continents, including Beijing, where you visited the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, India, Brazil, South Korea, and Kenya, just to name a few of the various places that you went. What was the most memorable moment from your trip while researching your book, Empty Planet?
It was in Delhi. So we were in Delhi, India. Actually, I was in Delhi, India. And I was in a slum, and I had asked our local team to maybe let me watch them do some interviewing in the slum. And they instead set up some focus groups for me to watch. And I was in this hut, like a schoolroom, with, torn English maps on the walls and things, and sitting on an upturned 5-gallon bucket with all these women talking about their families and about how they regarded families and what they thought about having children and what they thought about their futures. And I was so I did 2 groups of women in India, in Delhi, and it was in the local language, and the moderator would turn around and talk to me about what the person was saying. And sometimes I'd feed in some questions, but mostly I listened. And as we were getting close to the end of the focus group discussion, one young woman, I saw her sari glowing, and I was like, what's that? She ET? Has she got like some sort of a glowing heart or something? And she reaches into her sari and she pulls it out, and she's got a smartphone. And I'm in this like mud hut in the middle of this absolute slum in Delhi, with all of these people who are in these very impoverished situations, living one on top of each other, and power cables strung all over the place. It was something I'd never really experienced before. And she's got a smartphone, and she looks at it and she puts it back into her sari. And I thought, she has the world's knowledge in her hand. Anything that she needs to know about birth control and reproduction, she knows. Any role models that she needs to have access to, she has access to. So even though she's in that position, her world is a really big world. And the reason she's telling me what she's telling me about how she wants to change her life and why she wants to have fewer kids and why she wants to live a different life than her mother lived and her grandmother lived, and how she wants to have personal control of not only her life but her reproduction, all became very clear to me. It's not like she read a government pamphlet. She's got all of this information. And that all of a sudden just changed everything I thought about what we were looking at. And that anecdote's actually in the book. And to me was the most memorable. There was many memorable things, but that was one of the most memorable.
How does the concept of a shrinking planet in terms of population, how does that challenge the usual talk about the subject? Most people, I would think, if you were to poll the average person, most people would probably think we have overpopulation versus pending underpopulation. And what does underpopulation in the future, what does that mean as we make policies, and how does that shape the future?
Well, that's a big question, Jesse. I'll start with the first part of it. What does it mean? I mean, what it means is that basically just about everything that we've been told in popular culture about what the future of the population is now challenged. Going all the way back to the Enlightenment in Malthus, talking about how we were going to outgrow our population, reproduction was going to outgrow our ability to feed ourselves, which, by the way, I still hear everywhere. presented to, audiences in the agriculture community, and there's usually somebody on before me that talks about how we're going to have to gear up agriculture to feed this growing global population. Well, no, actually, that's not what's going to happen. We're going to peak probably somewhere between 8 and 9 billion people, probably closer to 8 than 9, sometime this century. Probably in the 2040s would probably be the right time to look at it. And then we're going to start to decline. And it'll be just as it was completely unpredictable on the way up, because we started back in around the Second World War between 2 and 3 billion people. Today we're 8 billion, at least that's what the UN told us about last year. And all of those things that came along with the growth from 2 billion to 8 billion, a lot of them were unpredictable, including the rise of youth culture, which never existed in the world before. But we're going to experience the same thing going down the other side of the mountain, because it's going to peak, it's going to go down, and what happens on the way down is going to be just in many ways as unpredictable as what happened on the way up. So to me, that's the interesting part of this. It's like, okay, once you recognize what's going on, then the next thing is, how is this going to influence our politics? How is it going to influence our economy? How is it going to influence the weight of various parts of the world in terms of global decision making? There's all sorts of consequences to what we're talking about here. But once you get to that point where you understand what you were told before is wrong, and you notice I didn't say probably wrong, it is wrong, about what the future of humanity is going to be, at least in terms of its size and its shape. Once you latch onto that point, then it opens up an entirely different conversation.
You mentioned that people still mention the whole Malthusian stuff, right? And I find it interesting that he wrote that essay in 1798, which was 162 years before birth control. That was, of course, before fertilizers, electricity. As more information becomes available, maybe you should have a new concept. But people always bring that up. And it's just like, you're talking about something that was theorized in 1798. That might have been true in 1798, but we're way past that.
Yeah, you would think. But, Paul Ehrlich in 1968 wrote a book called The Population Bomb, but was incredibly popular. Paul Ehrlich was on Johnny Carson. I mean, it was like the huge meme. And guess what? People paid attention. Soylent Green is people. We have, in fiction, we have that Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, about how we deal with overpopulation and in the world is such a popular, a forceful meme in popular culture that people have a really hard time getting over it. I mean, I still, get, because I watch this really closely, somebody puts up on Twitter, we've got to do something about global population growth. I mean, there's whole interest groups that are structured around this, and it's like, well, good. I mean, Jane Fonda came out, I'm terrified about getting the global population getting to 10 billion. I tweeted on the weekend, relax, Jane. It's not going to happen. What you really need to worry about is when the population is looking more like 8 billion people, like it is today, except it's way older. And then when it gets to 7 billion people, it gets even older. And 6 billion gets even older and less capable of reproducing itself. What does that look like? And that's a conversation we're just starting to have. Because when we first wrote this book, came out about 4 years ago in 2019, I guess coming up to 5 years ago, every question I got asked was, how can you possibly think this? I mean, everybody says that it's a completely different picture. And it was almost like, so every conversation I had with journalists or with podcasters like you was, prove that this is not the case, that we're going to get to 11.2 billion, which was the prediction of the UN at the time. We're not going to get to 11.2 billion, by the end of the century. Well, by the way, the UN has adjusted in the last couple of years its estimate down to 10.4 billion. We lost 800 million people in less than 5 years. The UN in terms of their projections to the end. So it was all of that kind of conversation. Now, when I have started this conversation like we did today, it's like, okay, you don't have to justify that. It's basically accepted that this is the direction of travel that we're going to go in terms of the shape of humanity, the size of humanity. Now we're on to what are the consequences about related to that. And to me, that's where this conversation is going. But it's a very different conversation than we were having 5 years ago.
According to the World Bank, which gets its figures from the United Nations Population Division, which you referenced several times in your book, but they reports that the global fertility rate in 1963 was 5.3. And then in less than 60 years, the latest numbers I saw was from 2021. And they reported a global fertility rate of 2.3. Keep in mind that the replacement rate is 2.1. And outside of 10 African countries, which have a fertility rate between about 5 and 6.8, the vast majority of Western or developed countries have a fertility rate of well below 2. You got China was maybe between 0.8 to 1.2. What is it, like Taiwan is around 1. Japan is like 1.3. When will this collapse really be felt globally? What year, and then what regions are really going to be the most impacted by this?
Well, we're feeling it now. So there are countries like Japan that lose 1 million people from their population every year. 1 million people. When I used to give presentations on this 5 years ago, I always put up the top 10 countries in terms of population size. Well, Japan's fallen off the list. Mexico's replaced it. In some places in the world, it's actually happening right now. I mean, Italy loses close to 100,000 people from their population every year. So does Greece, so does Spain. There are parts of the world that are already going through this that are showing what the future looks like. And it's a big challenge.
What are some ways that these countries are able to combat this? It seems like Japan has been fighting with this for decades. People always talk about how Japan has a high debt to GDP ratio, and they have millions of centenarians, whatever, in their country. But if you talk to anyone that's visited Japan or lived in Japan, like my fiance's brother lived there for 7 years, everyone loves Japan. Everyone says it's like the greatest place to live. And they have a lot of robots and with AI and things like that. Maybe there's a way that you can actually live with the aging population.
Well, that's because Japan basically offshores its labor activities and then also does labor substitution with automation. But the problem is, and this is the Japanese problem, is they don't have a growing consumer population. So the problem with declining population and an aging population, we always see as a labor issue. But technology can substitute for that. We can expand the age of retirement. I mean, we're living healthy and all the rest of it. The real problem that we're dealing with is consumption, because robots don't buy cars. So you can produce as much as you want, but if there's fewer people buying it, then you won't have economic growth. And so Japan has perpetually been in a situation where it really hasn't had a lot of economic growth. What they did was they took advantage of places like, for example, the United States and Canada, which, if the median age of Canada today, where I'm sitting, is 41, median age in Japan is 48. Median age in the United States is 38. The average person in Japan, median in the middle, half is older, half is younger in the population. That number in Japan's 10 years older than the United States. So people think that the reason that they put car plants in, Nashville or wherever you want to put it, is because they reduce the amount of transportation distance for those products. Well, that's part of it. The other part is they need access to American labor, or they need access to Chinese labor, they need access to Indian labor, because they don't have a workforce that's young enough to be able to do this. The only other option is to do it all through automation, and it's not quite that developed. Japan is an interesting case to take a look at, but they've been dealing with this for a bit longer. And the way that they've been dealing with it mostly is by offshoring their labor. But now even they're looking at trying to start up some form of immigration, because you need people to take care of the older population. So they're going to need nurses, they're going to need care workers, they're going to need people to look after a really aged population. The other thing that we don't talk about Japan is, Tokyo seems fantastic, but don't go to rural Japan, because there's nobody there. There's nobody there. They put mannequins in bus stops so people don't feel lonely. They're closing schools everywhere because there's no kids. So most of the population in Japan overwhelmingly is in their major cities. Rural Japan's just empty. It's emptied out.
What country do you think is going to be hit hardest? Do you think
China?
If you read Peter Zeihan, that's basically what he says, but you would agree with that China.
100%. 100%. I think Peter Zeihan's right about that. There's parts of his book I disagree with, but on the population part, he's reasonably accurate. The problem in China is that they are going to lose half their population this century. But that doesn't stop people. I was at a Global Economic Forum session in September, and I had followed some economists from Singapore getting up talking about how this was China's economic century, and didn't mention population once. It was like, how can it be China's economic century if they're going to lose half their population? Half. And what's left is going to be really old.
As I mentioned in my opening question, where you actually visited the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, like in Peter Zeihan's book, he basically says the numbers are highly inflated what China releases, and it's the CCP. Do you really believe they have every incentive to lie? Would you really believe the numbers coming out of China anyways? It could be 0.5 for all we know what the actual fertility rate is, right?
And in Beijing, it probably is. Or Shenzhen, it probably is, because we know in the urban centers that the fertility rates are really low. So that's the overall birth rate for China, although China, the rural areas of China have basically been depopulated. It's had one of the fastest transitions to urbanization anywhere in the world since 1960. So, yeah, and you can just tell what the issue is in China, not by the statistics that they give out, but by their own pronouncements. So, Xi just held the Women's Congress in December in Beijing, and his last statement was, now go home and have kids. They've changed all their advertising, which used to be, one and done. Now, 3 kids is the best thing. There was a great article in the New York Times about it this weekend, how they changed all fertility-related advertising. Because a lot of people still think China has a one-child policy. They got rid of it 5 or 6 years ago. And now you can basically have as many kids as you want, but nobody's having them.
I had Paul Moreland on, who's the UK's leading demographer. He says that it's a lot easier to get people to have less kids than it is to get people to have more kids. And one of the ways to increase population, of course, is through immigration. But a country like China, you're not going to get immigrants to China, nor do I think they want
net migration.
Yeah.
Migration out.
Right. It's migration out.
Yeah, one of the biggest diasporas in the world. And these are people who are not pining to go back to China. So you ask me who's going to be affected by this, demographic implosion, the worst, China, by far.
And then let's just kind of flip that question around. What countries will be least affected?
Oh, the U.S. is on a better track than anybody else because its population tends to be disproportionately younger. Its birth rate tends to be higher than most other countries. And it's still the number one place that everybody in the world wants to move to. So if the United States can get its immigration situation straightened out, in particular, it's going to be in a really good situation. Now, really good situation compared to itself historically? No. But compared to every other place in the world, yes. So particularly the 2 superpower competitors, China, I just explained what was going on. Russia's in a death spiral with its population as well. They lose several million, at least 1 million people every year that they admit to. And with the war, they've lost huge numbers of people, particularly young people who've just left. So that's a topic that there isn't really discussed very much, but probably one of the reasons that Putin is doing what he's doing is because he sees what's going on demographically. So he's trying to expand the Russian population through militarism. I mean, we used to try and expand the living room, the space that people had, the resources that they have. Now we're actually just going after people. So Russia's got a big problem. The United States doesn't have the same problem.
In your book, you have a quote that I found interesting. I'll just read the quote. You write, since the economic crisis of 2008, more people have gone back to Mexico and Latin America than have come north to the U.S. Researchers studying the phenomenon cite a weakening American economy, greater availability of jobs in Mexico, and the declining Latino fertility rate, end of your quote. And Peter Zeihan basically said the same thing as well. And he even wrote his book, I think it came out in 2022. So this is even going on during COVID. With all the news right now about all these immigrants coming into the U.S., is this basically just a way to repopulate all the immigrants that left since the global financial crash in 2008?
Maybe. I don't think we've got really good data yet on how that all nets out. So what we do know is that the formal immigration system in the United States, particularly during the Trump years, really declined. And also what happened on the southern border, the informal immigration process also declined. So net, we don't know since 2008 that, and I think it'll probably take a little bit of time to shake out. But we have seen a substantial amount of immigration, renewed immigration into the United States. But all that does is it basically moves a working age population from those places to the United States. If the United States can figure out a way to integrate these people, probably to the benefit of the United States, but boy, does this cause problems when you go south of the border. Because you have rapidly aging populations there. And, there's probably news for people listening to this podcast. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 countries in Latin America that has above replacement rate fertility. I mean, we have this view that they're producing tons and tons of kids in Mexico, and the truth is the American birth rate and the Mexican birth rate are fairly similar.
That the UN stats I was mentioning before about the population, they have all of Latin America and Caribbean at a fertility rate of 1.9.
Yeah. There's a couple that may be a little higher, but they're really small. But yeah, and so when you say that to people, Jesse, it's like, you got to be kidding. Show me the tape. And you go and show them the tape, and it's like, oh my God, I didn't know that. But this is a story all over the world.
the first thing you to tell someone like, hey, they're going to have less people in 30 years, I think they'd be happy though. What are, I guess, the pros? And then the flip side of that, what are the cons to a ever shrinking populated world?
Well, if you live in a crowded place, you probably like the idea of fewer people. And also if your priority is focusing on the environment and things like, for example, climate change, then probably you're going to be thinking that this is a great thing. But the truth is that there are many aspects to what this is going to involve in terms of change that people aren't taking into account. So, for example, it's not just the shrinking population, it's the aging of the population. And every day the human population gets less and less capable of reproducing itself. And that's because every day we get a little older. And since we only produce people the old-fashioned way, we're getting less capable of being able to replace the people that weren't born through the space of the last 20 years, for example, the last generation. So you look at that and you say, okay, well, let's look at the years 2030 and the years 2040. So the year 2030, the entire global baby boom, as it has constituted, people born after the Second World War, are all going to be retirement age. Everyone in 2030. So we're not talking about 20 years from now. We're not talking about 30 years from now. We're talking about 6 years from now. And in the 2040s to 2050s, that entire baby boom is going to be departing this mortal coil. Yes, we're living older, but not that much older. So maybe, the longevity in the United States goes from the high 70s into the low 80s, but it doesn't go into the high 90s. So that generation is going to be leaving. And when they leave, what follows them is not like a brand new young generation that look back like the Second World War. It's also an old generation. And so the global population continues to age and continues to lose its ability to reproduce itself. And at what point does that, do you reach a tipping point there? Because the UN's assumptions, and a lot of demographers, when they talk about this, is at some point you reach an equilibrium, which is probably around replacement rate, 2.1. By the way, replacement rate in the developing world is way higher because their infant mortality is higher. So in India, it's probably 2.4, 2.5. In Africa, maybe even over 3. So when we say replacement rate in Africa and India, it's not, in developing world, it's not the same as it is in developed countries. But once you get to this point of like an equilibrium, why would you assume that it exists? Because none of the countries that are going through this right now have reached those 2.1 equilibriums. In fact, they've continued to decline. And once you get into what some demographers call the low fertility trap, you are trapped. You can't get out of it. So even my country now, in Canada, our birth rate, we just recorded the lowest birth rate in Canadian history, 1.33. It's the same as Japan. If we didn't have immigration in this country, our population probably in the next 15 years would start to decline. And once that becomes your norm, your standard for what family size and reproduction is, it's not like it goes excessively in the other direction. It might go up a little bit, but it doesn't go back to replacement rate. It certainly doesn't go above replacement rate. So what are the consequences of reaching that mountain and then falling down in the dark? We don't really know.
I was listening to one of your other podcasts, and you're talking about, basically, like, how does this information change policy and things like that? And you're talking about how all these cities are putting in like these bike lanes, but it's like, are you going to have a bunch of 85-year-olds biking around? And it just made me think of like the way that they are trying to configure cities is probably more for young people versus the actual people that will be living in these cities in 20, 30 years from now.
Well, it does befuddle me the degree to which people who seem to say that they're doing things based on science seem to ignore basic data. Like, for example, in major cities, are people young or people old? Well, people who are probably renting are probably young. People who probably own their accommodation are probably older. So there's two audiences, but neither one of them has kids. Because the ones who are younger, when they have kids, they tend to move out. Now, that's not all cities, but certainly in North America, that's the case. Like downtown New York City, the fertility rate's almost nothing. But if you go out into the suburbs, the car commuting or train commuting or whatever type suburbs, it's different. And the reason that it's different is because people are raising kids, and they're usually raising them in bigger properties. So whenever I hear somebody say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to build all this densification downtown, all these apartments and stuff, it's like, for who? Because when you look at it, maybe it's actually for older people who are going to move to those places. They're not going to use They're not going around on bike lanes. Maybe you need to convert that probably to mobility device lanes or whatever. But when I say that to somebody, it's like, this is nonsense, because I've got this vision of what the ideal city looks like, in which it's, you go to your small apartment with its low carbon footprint, where you live with all these people who are just like you, and you're, a young up and comer, and this is where you're going to live, and you're going to get on your bicycle, and you're going to, go off to your office, where you're going to sit in these kind of communal sorts of things, where you can all spark these great ideas off of each other and work in this kind of communal type of environment. And it's like, yeah, a lot of those people left. They used the pandemic to go. And they really don't want to live in those one-bedroom apartments that you just described. They want to live in something else because they want to raise a family, perhaps, if they're going to raise a family. So who is this that you're building this for? I'm not really sure. And then you get back, well, we need, low income, diversified housing for people who are low income families. And that's what we need. It's like, okay, but what you need are actually high income people, because your expense needs in cities are really extreme. So you need actually people who can pay that. And if they're not going to live there because they don't want what you've structured, they want to move out, how are you going to pay for all of this? So when, businesses, we're still jockeying with this whole conversation about what return to the office is going to be in major cities. And if you've been following any of the real estate stories, and I'm sure you have, looking at how real estate is struggling downtowns and office buildings, they're struggling. Well, that's a problem for people who own office buildings, but it's a bigger problem for people who run cities, because they need the taxes that those people paid to pay for all the infrastructure they need, like transit and everything else. And if people who are business owners are going to say, well, we're going to move permanently to a hybrid type of a working environment, it's okay. Well, because that's basically what people, the office workers who commute in, who come in and have that cup of coffee, to have the dry cleaning done, do a little bit of shopping, go out for lunch. Those are the people who drive downtown economies. If they're not going to be there and they're not paying taxes and their employer needs less space, what are you going to do? It's going to be a very difficult situation to work out. But I don't hear anybody talking about that, or very few people. People who are in the real estate market are starting to talk about it, but they don't really want to talk about it too loud, because they don't want to talk about the economic peril that they find themselves in. But where you're going to see this play out, Jesse, is not like all at once. It's not going to be everybody's out and everybody's in. It's going to be, okay, we tried for the last 3 years to get people to come back to the office. Yeah, we've been successful for 2 or 3 days. That means I had 3 floors before. Maybe I only need 2, or maybe I only need 1.5. That's the problem. It's not going to be all at once. It's just going to be these incremental things that adjust to the way that people are going to be living their lives, particularly people who are working, how they're going to live their lives. And we're doing this thing right now through this methodology that we have here, through this technology. I've had probably 10 calls like this today, and I'm sitting close to downtown Toronto. Do I have to go into the office? At some point, yeah, probably we do, but do you need a whole office building for people to get together occasionally? And, my view on this is, if your problem is training, if your problem is culture, if your problem is connection, why is the equal sign in that equation real estate? I don't understand. You can deal with all of those other things. Maybe some of it involves real estate. Maybe it's a better use of real estate, but none of it means more real estate. So this is the problem I have with cities. Like in my city here in Toronto, they use the pandemic to basically plaster this place with bicycle lanes. By the way, for your listeners, I have no problem with bicycle lanes. I think bicycles are great. I think that bicycle lanes are terrific. They keep people safe, but they plastered this place with very little thought to how it would interrupt the traffic for commuters. So they made it incredibly hard for people to get downtown, who used to come downtown, because we have no great train infrastructure in the city. And now they're eliminating parking because they want to build, low income housing. And, somebody living an hour out whose commute is now an hour and a half because it's harder to get in and out of the city, why would they come in? Why would they come into work? And by the way, they're pushing on their employer to make them come in less. Their employer, they've got 2 items on their balance sheet, the 2 big expenses, people and real estate. One of them makes the money, which is people. Why would they hold on to all that real estate? The answer is they're not going to. So if you're invested, by the way, if anybody here is an investor in an office space in major downtowns, you might want to think about that. because I think the culture is moving against you.
One of the trends that you talked about in your book a lot was urbanization as one of the main drivers of people having less kids. As you move to the city, get a job, stuck in these small spaces, not conducive to having children. But since the pandemic, we've actually seen the reverse trend where these mega cities, people are actually going away from those mega cities. And that trend, even in 2024, has continued.
Yeah, but they're not going. There's some people, and we'll all hear stories about how somebody moved to El Paso. But most of the people who are moving just a further commuting distance out. So it's not like they're moving completely away. They're just moving further out where they can get a bigger place for less money. So they're still remaining relatively proximate to a major city location. They're not moving to, rural Alaska. They're not doing that. Or they're not moving into, the desert someplace. They're not moving to, Allentown. They're not doing that. What they're doing is they're moving out a bit further than they used to move out. Now, that's so far. We'll see where it goes longer term. But, even in my own company, there are people moving a bit further away, but they tend to move to larger population areas. They don't move out to rural locations. They just move to more affordable places to live compared to where they were living.
One of the main reasons that, like, say, millennials and some of the younger generation cite for having either no kids or less kids is financial. Before the global financial crisis, in the U.S., the fertility rate was 2.12, so slightly above the replacement rate. And then since then, it's just dropped every year. Do you think if the economics and the economy turn around, that people will be going back and having more kids? If you feel like you can't afford kids or can't afford a house or you got too much student debt, that's a big barrier to forking out the money for diapers and everything else you need.
Yeah, all of that. The question, I would love to do the social experiment where I could say, if you make kids free, would you have more? I'm not so sure we would. I think the main reason that people don't want to have kids, in fact, our surveys show this. See, the Pew Center's done a similar survey in the United States. The top two reasons that people don't have kids, number one, I just don't want them. You know what? I like my life. Don't want to have kids. Maybe I'll have 2 dogs, maybe a cat. And maybe I'll have a couple extra vacations every year. I just don't want them. And then there's another group, the next group, are people who want to have them, but they can't have them. And the reason they can't have them is because they waited a long time. So people who waited to get into the situation that you were describing, where they now all of a sudden have funds available to be able to contemplate having a family, well, they're in their early 30s, they're in their mid 30s, really hard to have kids when you wait that long. So there's all the biological issues that relate to it. But then the other big issue is women in particular not being able to find a partner that they want to have kids with. So there's all of these cultural reasons, and that's really the story in Empty Planet, which is that you can talk about money all you want, but the real issue that we're dealing here with is culture. And it's people in this generation, the last couple of generations, feeling like they're not invested in what the next generation is going to be. They don't feel an obligation to recreate what the future is going to be through having kids. They just don't. And they've got all sorts of reasons for it. But ultimately, the two big ones are, I'm not invested in that. And the second one is because the way capitalism works and the way that I need to make sure that I can secure my position in this economic system that we have, I need to wait a long time. I need to go to school. The average Canadian woman, and similar in the United States, when she got married back in the 1960s, she got married around the age of 21, 22. And then she had her first kid soon after. And the United States had 3 or slightly more kids. Canada had four kids. That was the average in 1960. Today, the average American Canadian woman gets married in their late 20s, has 1 kid, and maybe 2. And that's it.
In your book, Empty Planet, when you're talking about when you're in Brazil and how they watch the telenovelas, the TV shows there, and basically that is like a model of having less kids from these TV shows. The media is basically, I feel like oftentimes Hollywood is just propaganda. Like back in the day, you have like the Leave It to Beavers and the Brady Bunch, and back to Brazil example. Right now, it's like the girl boss and all this stuff where I feel like a lot of women are basically finding out that being a girl boss and having all this responsibility, working 90 hours a week, isn't that fun and not that rewarding. And it seems like maybe there will be a pushback. You already see like this trend online back to traditional roles, people homeschooling, and just kind of trends like that. I mean, you got states like South Dakota that actually have above fertility rate. The Mormon population is quite a bit above. So there are segments in the U.S., but there are segments, and it maybe won't flip around in, say, 5-10 years, but no trends go on forever, right? I mean, they eventually reverse, they eventually change. Nothing's really linear forever.
Yeah, that could happen. All of a sudden, people say, I want to have 4 kids again. I mean, because by the way, 4 kids wasn't the norm before the Second World War either. People tended to have small families. They tended to get married later. It was just a very specific period of time that human behavior, culture changed in enough countries that we actually had a baby boom and increased the population as we did. Most of the other places, it wasn't because they had tons of kids. It was because they expanded longevity. So most of the growth in the human population today is not as a result of having lots of kids. It's because we're living longer. We're not dying as fast as we used to. So those numbers add up. But somebody may work that out, but nobody has. So if there's a way to change the culture, countries are trying desperately to do that, and nobody has succeeded. Maybe an authoritarian state like China can figure it out, but so far, they've had no more luck than anybody else. In fact, less luck. Where I see this going is actually turning into a political debate, a political discussion about what our responsibilities are going to be to the future and how we regard this issue. I think it's a sleeper issue that's going to become more and more important in political debate, discourse going forward, and even in places like the United States. When we start talking about what our future generation is going to look like, or future generations are going to look like, and what our responsibilities, if any, that we have for creating that next generation. So fertility is going to become a big political issue, and not in the way that it is right now, which is basically focused on things like abortion. And it's the abortion issue has always been basically a wedge issue into trying to control women in general. It's not just about abortion. But what's going to be really interesting going forward is this, it's debate between the rights of women versus the rights of the unborn. And what you're going to potentially start seeing in some places is the rights of the state come into this. So we need people. How would you be, not having them or creating them? How would you be aborting them? There's it's basically the Margaret Atwood Handmaid's Tale type discussion that could become more of a political debate. I certainly hope not. I mean, it'd be terrible to think that we were having these kinds of conversations where the state would be intervening in the choices that people make. I don't think it leads to anything good. But this is going to become a very pointed and difficult discussion going forward, because an increasing number of countries are going to be confronted with the fact that they're shrinking and they're old. And that doesn't bode well for the future. And maybe it will not be in 10 years, but in 15, 20, 25 years, it's going to absolutely become something that people are going to be confronting in a public policy sense. And the problem is that most of the public policy conversation that takes place around this is misguided. And it's basically, nice liberal folks and by that I mean like more traditional, not the really strong progressive approach, but most people in the center would be working in government and academic institutions and other places where they'd say, well, really what this is about is market failure. If we just gave people the right incentives, so in other words, if we just made childcare cheaper, or we just got rid of the motherhood penalty in career paths, if we just did things that were more kid-friendly, people would have more kids. Except it's been tried a lot, and it doesn't work. And the reason is because the real problems that we're dealing with are these cultural problems where people feel no need to participate in creating whatever the future is going to be because they're not going to be part of it. It's basically what it is.
Do you think Peter Zeihan's overall thesis is right, that we're going to have this depopulation, we're going to have deglobalization, we're going to have a whole shift in government and things like that? He doesn't paint too pretty of a future, at least for the globe as a whole.
Yeah, I read his book. The population material is, I think, pretty good. And he does focus on the part of it that you and I just discussed, which is it's really not a labor problem, it's a consumption problem. when we take a look at it. It's not an original idea, by the way. There's other people who've talked about similar kinds of things. The problem that I have with Zihan's book is that his certainty about the evolution of geopolitics and the role of the United States in it, I don't think is entirely clear. So his view is the United States is basically going to go back to pre-Second World War position where it sees itself as not being really, not for it being necessary for it to be involved in anything really outside of its own borders, that it's just going to focus on itself and its own issues. And I think there are parts of the political spectrum in the United States that do believe that. And we're seeing it right now, particularly in the Republican Party, and their views of things, for example, like supporting Ukraine or being involved in having any sort of foreign engagement. But the problem that it has is I don't think the United States is as self-contained as Peter Zeihan thinks it is. I think that the United States benefits an awful lot from international trade too. And we can look at Canada, Mexico, and the United States being a very fortunate and advantaged bloc because the United States can take advantage of Mexico's younger population and larger labor force. And in Canada, we have access to all sorts of resources. I mean, our biggest export partner is the United States. We have all of these resources that the United States can take advantage of. But, Canadians have their own political will too. So do Mexicans. And what's in the United States' interest may not necessarily be in Canadian interest or Mexican interest. So they've got a point of view on these things too. And they may not be as isolationists either. So the issue that I have with Peter Zeihan's book is I think his presentation of what, and I know why he did it. I mean, it's a really interesting thing. It's a bit jaw-dropping to go out and talk to people and say what he's saying about global geopolitics. But I don't think that the ability for the United States to just pull itself out of what's happening in the world is as easy as he portrays it.
With basically the collapsing of demographics, that we are going to have massive changes, all right? I mean, even China doesn't have the population to do the manufacturing. They even had to outsource their manufacturing to like Bangladesh, right? And then, with India, they're going to have major issues as well.
Where he's right is that when you look at domestic markets and the ability to have a consumer market that can support the economic consumption required by a particular economy like Germany. He's very hard on Germany in the book. Because Germany's gone all in on high engineering, manufacturing, exports. So, when you have a declining population that isn't consuming these things, and all of a sudden the export market goes away because Americans aren't buying things Chinese are, then Germany, because it's so dependent on exports, is going to be in trouble. He's got a point. But the idea that the United States doesn't have a necessity to keep the Suez Canal open, I don't know that that's necessarily as easy to go along with, or that doesn't, because it has the largest Blue Navy fleet in the world, that it isn't going to use that Blue Navy fleet to achieve its foreign policy goals, not just by putting a cordon sanitaire around the United States, but by participating in the world to the advantage of the United States. I think that that's a stretch for me. But, who knows? 15 years ago, you can play this back and you can say, aha, you were wrong about that. And he was right. I just don't think the United States is that prepared to be that isolationist, even the Republicans. I think they want a foreign policy that works to their advantage, and they want a trade policy that works to their advantage too. And international trade is part of that. This idea that we're going to put up a big fence around everything, and everything that all the resources that we need and all the consumption that we need and all the labor that we need is captured in those three countries, which is what he argues. I don't think that works for the United States.
So is basically the biggest issue of not having enough young people is you don't have enough consumers, and then tax, right?
You don't have enough consumers, but then you also don't have enough people who can produce the next generation. Right? Because we all time out in terms of our ability to create the next generation. So it's not just that you don't have enough consumers, it's that our ability to reproduce this, to deal with this, to fill in those holes gets less and less and less every day. That's both issues.
I mean, right now, everything is kind of measured in GDP. And so if GDP goes down, then people say growth goes down. But if we were to use a different measurement, like we were talking about Peter Zeihan's book, I mean, there's things I agree with, things I disagree with, but where he's talking about a different governmental model, I would think you'd have to have a different governmental model, because if everything is measured by consumption and consumption goes down, well, then you need to reevaluate or redo something.
Yeah, you do. But the issue is that you could put taxes on production. But if what's being produced isn't being consumed, production is going to decline too. So, I mean, the problem that you've got is you've got a population that's not in the consumptive part of their lives. So older people don't buy new cars. They don't buy new houses. They don't buy consumer goods. They'll keep the same pair of shoes for 10 years. They're not participating in the economy, at least the way the economy is structured. My personal view is that the real challenge for people who are in any consumer goods or consumer services business is how to re-engage with older populations to get them to be consumers again, rather than ignoring them, which is what basically happens now. They're invisible, especially older women, just invisible.
You kind of mentioned the word investor before. How would investors use this information to plan businesses or entrepreneurship if we're going to be having an older population, less kids? How do you set yourself up as an investor?
Well, if demography is destiny, it's also economics and politics. So take a look at what the construction is of your population and what the behavior is of your population. You'll have a good understanding of what the consumption patterns are going to be based on what you produce. And you're probably going to have to change it. And so everything from, we talked about commercial real estate through to car manufacturers. I mean, who's going to be driving around these little cars that people can't get in and out of? You know, restaurants. One of my favorites is restaurants. And what I say to every restaurant presentation I give is, turn down the music so somebody can have a conversation, turn up the lights so I can see the menu, you know, put a spot at the front of the restaurant where I can put my mobility device if I need to, make it easy for me to get in and out of where I go, and make it a social place for older people to go, particularly older women, and maybe they'll start showing up. Stop creating things that are made for 15-year-olds because there isn't that many of them and they don't have any money. I mean, I went to something recently where we got a presentation on sports, and there was all these marketing experts on sports, and they're all talking about, you know, these moments, and people are not consuming and sitting and watching broadcasts. So you got to push everything on smartphones, and, you know, interaction and all the rest of it. It's saying, okay, well, so you've manufactured sports for a 15-year-old. There isn't as many of them as you think, and they don't have any money. What about their parents and their grandparents who actually have the time, perhaps, to watch a sporting event? What are you doing for them? Wasn't any part of the conversation at all. It's all about the kids. How you get the next generation. What if I told you that we're no longer in the baby boom? Stop acting like it's 1965, because it's not anymore. It's 2024, and that baby boom is that entire baby boom is going to be 65 years of age or older by 2030. What are you making for them? Think about them, because they've actually got all the money. It's not only that they're the biggest part of the population, they also actually have all the assets. They have the only pensions anybody's going to have. They have the real estate that everybody wants. They probably had pretty good paying jobs and had them for a fairly long period of time. So what are you making for them? Because the answer is almost nothing.
Yeah, like the fastest growing community in the U.S. is the villages in Florida, that retirement community.
Yeah, Florida's figured it out, and we're starting to figure it out. But like if you're like a sports consumption, and like I said, I was listening to this, it was like, who are you making this for? And just as like you were talking about bike lanes, who are you making these for? If the average person, you know, commuting to work is going to be 50 years old, how many of them are going to be taking a bicycle? Particularly if they live in a place that has snow 4 months of the year. Well, what is this? This is not urban planning. This is ideology in concrete. You know, that excludes the people that you need to come into the city because you've manufactured no alternative for them. So guess what? They're going to stay home. And guess what? The Class B buildings are going to be in big trouble. And for a while, the Class A buildings will take advantage of that. But then the Class A buildings that you're still building, they're going to be in trouble too. And by the way, you're not going to be able to convert them into residences because residences don't pay the level of taxes that the businesses do. So it's not going to work for you. You're going to need to think about what the future of the city is going to be. New York City's already got problems with this. And by the way, New York is still a place that's a magnet for people, right? A lot of people want to be in that area. But there's other cities that are not going to be in the same situation. And they're going to struggle, like San Francisco and Los Angeles and even places like Chicago. They're going to have a tough time.
I used to bike to work when I was living in Denver, and I'd say most people don't do it because one, like, hey, messes up your hair if you're sweaty and you get to work. What do? You got a shower if you don't have a shower there. If you have to bring stuff to work, it's just not really practical for most types of employment anyways.
No, it's not. And when you live in a place that's increasingly suburbanized, when people, unless they have a transit methodology for getting to where they need to be, are probably going to be in their cars. Why would you create infrastructure that makes it harder for them to get in? Not that I'm all over cars and that being the best way. I mean, obviously we need much better transit, but if you're going to struggle trying to revitalize these downtowns, you're not going to do it by creating the downtowns of the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Because I keep hearing this Jane Jacobs stuff about cities as well. And it's like, yeah, those are great places, eyes on the street in the neighborhood, very diversified and all the rest of it. Guess what they didn't have? Any services. There was no community services. You're on your own. Now everybody wants, everything for homelessness through to, different school programs and all sorts of. They didn't have any of that. It was a cheap place to live. Downtowns in most cities are very expensive places to live now. So who's going to pay for that? Well, it used to be cross-subsidized by business taxes. And if the employees, and as I say to clients all the time, it's not like it has to be off or on. Just 2 days a week less downtown is 40% less activity downtown. And by the way, you probably need 40% less space too.
So today's guest is Dr. Darrell Bricker. He's co-author of the book Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Declining. I just got 2 final questions so I can get you out of here. But just first, where can people find you, get a hold of you, get your book, etc.? And then secondly, just leave us with a final thought.
Probably the easiest way is I'm one of the easiest people to find. Just go online and you can find my email address, or I'm on Twitter. You can follow me there, or X, I guess as we're calling it now, and go read Empty Planet. I think it's an interesting book and people will enjoy it. Sounds like it's a book that's full of statistics, and it's not. I mean, you've read it. It's like a travelogue, right? It's like we go to these places. I think there's one chart in the entire book. And I think it's a pretty easy read. And if you're into this topic, I think this will give you a good start to it. And the final thing is, open your eyes and take a look at what's actually going on. Take a look at what's actually going on out there. And don't just think about what we've been talking about in terms of big statistics and big things. Just look at your own family and just think about how many kids did your grandparents have? How many kids do your parents have? How many kids do you have? How many kids are your kids going to have? And then maybe you'll go out and get a copy of Empty Planet to understand why that's happening.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.